The rain had been falling on Briarton Avenue for 3 hours straight, the kind of rain that turned the city into a watercolor of itself, bleeding neon into asphalt, smearing headlights into long amber ribbons that slithered across the pavement like something alive. The diner sat at the corner of Briarton and 9th, a narrow box of fogged glass and fluorescent light wedged between a shuttered pawnshop and a laundromat that never closed, its dryers tumbling endlessly through the night like mechanical heartbeats. The sign above the door read, "Rosie's" in faded crimson script, though no one named Rosie had owned the place in 15 years, and the R had been flickering for 6 months, casting a stuttering half-light across the wet sidewalk that made the entrance look like a wound opening and closing. Inside, the air smelled of coffee that had been sitting too long, bacon grease embedded in the ceiling tiles, and the faint chemical sweetness of the lemon-scented cleaner that never quite masked the deeper, older scent of decades of quiet human desperation soaked into the vinyl booths and linoleum floors. Elena Maris stood behind the counter with a dish rag in her hand, wiping the same spot she had wiped 4 times in the last 10 minutes, not because it was dirty, but because her hands needed something to do that was not shaking. She was 25 years old, though the shadows beneath her eyes and the careful, measured way she moved suggested someone who had been carrying weight far longer than that. Her dark hair was pulled back in a low ponytail that hung past her shoulder blades, a few loose strands framing a face that was striking in its stillness, the kind of face that street painters in the Old Quarter would have begged to sketch, all clean angles and dark, watchful eyes that held a sadness so deep it had become structural, load-bearing, something she had built herself around rather than something she carried. Her uniform was the color of weak tea, a polyester blend that fit nowhere and everywhere, the kind of garment designed to make the wearer disappear into the institution she served. She had been disappearing into it for 14 months. Tonight she had $11 in her checking account, 6 of which she had already mentally allocated to the bus fare that would get her home and back again tomorrow, leaving $5 and some coins to her name until her next paycheck landed in 41 hours. She did not think of this as poverty. She thought of it as arithmetic, and arithmetic, unlike hope, did not lie. The diner was nearly empty. A long-haul trucker in a thermal vest sat in the far booth, hunched over a plate of eggs he was eating with the mechanical focus of a man who measured his life in miles between rest stops. A college student near the window had fallen asleep with her forehead on an open textbook, her laptop glowing beside her like a small blue altar. The cook, a heavyset man named Denny who had worked at Rosie's since before Elena was born, was somewhere behind the kitchen partition, the sound of his portable radio leaking a low, tinny stream of late-night jazz that mixed with the hiss of the rain outside into something that was almost music. The clock above the pie case read 11:47. Elena's shift ended at midnight. 13 more minutes of standing, of wiping, of existing in this amber-lit purgatory between the day she had survived and the night she would endure, and then she could walk through the rain to the bus stop on Clement Street and ride home to the studio apartment where her mother's hospital bills sat in a neat stack on the kitchen table, each one a small white monument to the cost of keeping someone alive in a country that charged admission for breathing. The door opened. Not violently, not with the theatrical slam of someone escaping the weather, but with a precise, controlled movement that suggested the person entering had never in his life done anything without intention. The rain sounds rushed in for a moment, the hiss and patter of water on concrete and metal, and then the door closed behind him, and the diner's insulated silence reassembled itself around his presence like a room rearranging its furniture to accommodate a new and dominant piece. He was tall, not extraordinarily so, but tall enough that the low ceiling of Rosie's seemed to compress around him, the fluorescent tubes throwing his shadow long and sharp across the floor in a way that made the space feel suddenly smaller, more intimate, more charged. He wore a black suit that fit him the way architecture fits a city skyline, not merely covering the frame beneath, but defining it, articulating it, every line of the jacket following the contour of his shoulders and torso, with a precision that spoke of hands that had measured and cut and stitched with the same care a surgeon brings to an incision. No tie. The collar of a white shirt open at the throat, the fabric so fine it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His shoes were black, Italian, the leather catching the fluorescent glare in a single clean line as he walked. His hair was dark, cut close, and his face was the kind of face that made you think of old European portraiture. All sharp planes and controlled angles, the jaw defined, the cheekbones prominent, the mouth set in a line that was not quite a frown, but suggested that smiling was something he did rarely and only with purpose. His eyes were dark, almost black in the diner's washed-out light, and they moved across the room with the unhurried precision of a man who had learned long ago that every space he entered was a landscape to be assessed, mapped, and understood before a single word was spoken. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a little older, but age was not the operative metric. Presence was. And his presence filled the room the way a bass note fills a cathedral, felt more than heard, vibrating in the bones of the building itself. He sat at the counter. Not in a booth, not at a table. At the counter, 3 stools from the register, placing himself in Elena's direct line of sight, with the casual deliberateness of a man who understood that proximity was a form of communication. He set his hands flat on the countertop, fingers splayed, and Elena noticed them. She noticed them because her mother had been a pianist before the illness, and her mother had taught her that you could read a person's entire biography in their hands. His were large, the knuckles prominent, but not scarred, the fingers long and precise, the nails clean and trimmed with a meticulousness that bordered on surgical. These were not the hands of a man who worked with them. These were the hands of a man who used them to give orders that other hands carried out. She approached him because that was her job. She set a laminated menu on the counter in front of him and placed a glass of water beside it, the ice cubes clicking against each other with a sound like small, cold applause. He did not look at the menu. He looked at her. Not the way men in diners usually looked at her, which was either not at all or with the vague, appraising hunger of someone deciding whether to order dessert. He looked at her the way a jeweler examines a stone, not with desire, but with recognition, as if he was identifying something in her that she had spent 14 months trying to hide. "Just coffee," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need volume because it carried authority the way a river carries current, deep beneath the surface. Just coffee. Black. She poured it. The pot was half empty. The coffee was at least 30 minutes old, and it poured in a thin, dark stream that looked like something extracted from the earth, rather than brewed from beans. She set the cup in front of him, and he wrapped his hands around it, not drinking, just holding it, as if the warmth of the ceramic was the first thing he had felt in hours. The rain intensified outside, hammering against the plate glass windows with a percussive fury that made the diner feel like a submarine submerged in noise. Elena returned to her position by the register and resumed wiping the counter. She did not watch him. She had learned that watching powerful men was a mistake, because they always felt it. The way a predator feels the gaze of prey, and the acknowledgement of their power was itself a form of submission she could not afford. But she was aware of him the way you are aware of a change in atmospheric pressure, a tightening of the air, a sense that the room's center of gravity had shifted and was now located exactly where he sat. He drank his coffee slowly, in small, deliberate sips, and when the cup was empty, he raised one finger, not waving, not gesturing, just lifting a single index finger a half-inch above the counter's surface. And Elena refilled it without a word. Efficiency without intimacy, a transaction stripped to its barest mechanics. She was good at that. She had become good at reducing every interaction in her life to its functional minimum, cutting away the excess like a sculptor, removing everything that was not the statue, until what remained was clean and cold and survivable. Denny's radio shifted to a slow, mournful trumpet piece, the notes drifting through the kitchen partition like smoke, and somewhere outside a siren wailed and faded, rising and falling through the rain like a mechanical grief. The college student stirred, rubbed her eyes, checked her phone, and began packing her things with the sluggish movements of someone who had been dreaming of a life she had not yet built. The trucker had finished his eggs and was staring out the window at the rain with the blank, enduring patience of a man who had seen 1,000 nights exactly like this one, and expected 1,000 more. 11:58. 2 minutes until midnight. Elena had already begun the closing inventory in her head, the small choreography of tasks that would release her from this space and return her to the other space, the one with the hospital bills, and the empty refrigerator, and the mattress on the floor where she slept in the clothes she would wear again tomorrow, because doing laundry cost quarters she did not have. The man in the black suit finished his second cup and set it down with a precision that made no sound at all, the ceramic meeting the countertop in a kiss so controlled it was as if the cup itself had been instructed to be silent. He reached into his jacket, his hand disappearing into the inner breast pocket with the practiced smoothness of a motion performed 1,000 times, and withdrew a slim black card. He held it between 2 fingers and extended it toward Elena without looking up. She took it. She ran it through the ancient card reader mounted beside the register, the machine whirring and clicking with the arthritic complaint of technology that should have been retired years ago. The machine processed. The machine beeped. The machine displayed 2 words on its cracked green screen. Card declined. Elena stared at the screen. She ran the card again. The same 2 words. Card declined. She looked at the card in her hand, and even in the diner's unflattering light, she could see that it was not a normal credit card. It was matte black, no visible numbers on the front, the name embossed in the same shade of black as the card itself, so that you could only read it by tilting the surface and catching the light. The kind of card that existed for people who did not need anyone to know they had money, because the money itself was a foregone conclusion. She had never held anything like it. It felt heavier than a card should feel, as if it was made of something denser than plastic. She looked up at him. His expression had not changed. There was no embarrassment on his face, no irritation, no flicker of the social discomfort that most people displayed when their payment was refused in a public space. He simply looked at her with those dark, assessing eyes, and waited. "Our machine does that sometimes," Elena said, and her voice was steady because she had practiced steadiness the way a soldier practices marksmanship, through repetition and discipline until it became reflex. "The wiring is old. Let me try once more." She tried once more. Card declined. The green screen was absolute, indifferent, a small machine passing a small judgment that had nothing to do with the man who sat before her, and everything to do with the fraying infrastructure of a diner that could not afford to replace a card reader that had been installed during a presidential administration Elena could barely remember. The man watched her with a stillness that was almost architectural. He did not reach for a wallet. He did not pull out cash. He simply sat, his hands returned to their flat position on the counter, his eyes on hers with an intensity that was not aggressive, but was undeniably present. The gaze of someone accustomed to having problems solved on his behalf, not because he could not solve them himself, but because the people around him understood that his time was a currency more valuable than whatever was being transacted. Elena looked at the register. 2 coffees. $4.30 with the late-night surcharge. She looked at the man. She looked at the stack of quarters and bills in the tip jar. The thin collection of other people's gratitude that would be split between her and Denny at the end of the week. She did not reach for the tip jar. She reached into the front pocket of her apron, where she kept the emergency $5 bill she had been carrying for 3 days, the bill she had mentally designated as the margin between solvency and free fall, and she slid it across the counter toward the register. She rang up the sale. She made the change. She put the coins in the tip jar, and she did all of this without ceremony, without hesitation, without the performative generosity that would have turned a simple act into a spectacle. "It is on me," she said. "The machine is our problem, not yours." For the first time since he had entered the diner, something shifted in his face. Not a smile, nothing so overt, but a micro-movement in the muscles around his eyes, a slight narrowing, a recalibration, as if he had been looking at one thing and had suddenly realized he was looking at something else entirely. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of moment that in the world of ordinary interactions would have been uncomfortable, but in this strange, rain-drenched, fluorescent-lit space felt almost natural, as if time itself had agreed to slow down and let him see what he needed to see. He said nothing. He picked up his card from the counter, slid it back into his jacket, and stood. He was taller standing than sitting in the way that certain men are, as if gravity itself made concessions for them, and the full effect of his presence unfolded now like a flag unfurling in a wind that only he could feel. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned and walked to the door, opened it with that same precise, controlled motion, and stepped into the rain. The door closed. The diner exhaled. Elena stood behind the counter, the dish rag in her hand, the ghost of his presence still occupying the stool where he had sat. She could smell it now, something she had not registered while he was there because his proximity had overwhelmed her ordinary senses. A cologne, or perhaps not a cologne, but simply the scent of him. Something clean and dark and expensive that lingered in the air the way a bass note lingers after a symphony has ended. She wiped the counter where he had sat. She rinsed his cup. She clocked out at 12:03, retrieved her bag from the hook in the back hallway, and walked out into the rain. The bus stop on Clement Street was a 6-minute walk from the diner, and Elena made it in 5 because the rain was coming down at an angle now, driving against her face and soaking through her jacket in a way that was not cold so much as total. An immersion, as if the sky had decided to erase the boundary between inside and outside, and she was simply walking through a world that was all water. The bus shelter was a plexiglass box, with a cracked bench and an advertisement for a personal injury lawyer, whose smiling face had been partially obscured by a sticker reading, "Eat the Rich," in aggressive red letters. Elena sat on the bench, pulled her jacket tighter, and stared at the street. She did not think about the man in the black suit. She thought about the $5. She calculated what that $5 had represented. 2 bus rides, a loaf of bread from the discount shelf at the grocery store on Pine, a contribution to the payment plan she had negotiated with the hospital billing department, the plan that required $37 a month for the next 11 years to cover the balance of her mother's treatment, the treatment that had bought her mother 2 additional years of life, and Elena a debt that would follow her like a shadow well into her 30s. $5 was not nothing. $5, in the economy of her life, was a small brick removed from a wall that was already dangerously thin, and she had given it to a stranger in a suit that probably cost more than her annual rent. She did not regret it. Regret required the belief that she should have acted differently, and Elena did not believe that. Her mother, in the months before the end, lying in the hospital bed with the oxygen tube and the bruises from the IVs, and the hair that had grown back in thin silver wisps after the last round of treatment, had said something that Elena carried with her like a stone in her pocket, worn smooth by constant handling. "You will be poor," her mother had said, her voice reduced to a whisper that still somehow carried the full authority of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching music to children who could not afford instruments. "You will be poor, and you will be tired, and you will be tempted every single day to become hard. Do not become hard. Hardness is not strength. Kindness when you cannot afford it. That is strength." The bus arrived at 12:22, its headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights sweeping a prison yard. Elena boarded, tapped her transit card, and sat in the back row beside a window streaked with water that turned the passing city into an impressionist painting. She rode 17 stops to the neighborhood where her apartment building squatted on a corner like a tired animal, 3 stories of brown brick and rusted fire escapes and windows that glowed with the cheap, warm light of lives being lived in small, careful increments. She climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, unlocked her door, and entered the space she called home. 400 square feet. A kitchenette with a 2-burner stove, a bathroom with a shower stall, and a mirror she avoided. The mattress on the floor, made up with sheets that were clean because cleanliness was the last luxury she could control. The stack of hospital bills on the kitchen table. She did not turn on the overhead light. She sat on the mattress in the dark, peeled off her wet shoes, and listened to the rain against the window. She did not know that the man whose coffee she had paid for was Dominic Valenti. She did not know that name, and if she had heard it, it would have meant nothing to her because Elena Maris did not move in the world where that name was spoken, where it circulated through the upper corridors of power like a current of cold air, chilling conversations and straightening spines and closing doors that most people did not know existed. She did not know that Dominic Valenti controlled an organization whose financial footprint stretched across 11 states and 4 countries, whose legitimate holdings included commercial real estate, private security firms, a chain of restaurants that had been reviewed in every major publication, and a construction company that had built 3 of the city's most visible skyscrapers. She did not know that his illegitimate holdings were vaster still, a shadow empire of influence and leverage and carefully maintained alliances that operated beneath the surface of the city's economy, like a root system beneath a forest, invisible but essential, holding everything in place. She did not know that the black card she had held in her hand was linked to an account that contained a sum of money so large it was not measured in dollars, but in the abstract language of high finance, basis points and liquidity ratios, and portfolio allocations that existed as numbers on screens in offices she would never enter. She did not know any of this, because knowing it was not necessary for what she had done. She had seen a man whose payment had been declined, and she had covered his bill. The calculus was simple. The cost was $5. The reason was her mother's voice, whispering in the cathedral of her memory. What she also did not know was that Dominic Valenti had not experienced a card decline in his adult life. The card she had run through that ancient machine was not a credit card. It was a custom-issued account instrument linked to a private banking institution in Zurich, and the decline had not been a function of insufficient funds, but of the diner's card reader, which was so old it could not process the card's encrypted chip. Dominic had known this the moment she swiped it. He had known that any one of the 6 men sitting in the black SUV parked across the street could have walked in and paid the bill in cash. He had known that a single phone call would have resolved the issue in seconds. He had not made that call. He had not signaled his men. He had sat still, and he had watched, because Dominic Valenti had learned, through decades of navigating a world defined by betrayal and performance and the endless, exhausting theater of loyalty, that the only reliable measure of a human being's character was what they did when they believed no one of consequence was watching. And this woman, this waitress in a tea-colored uniform, with shadows under her eyes and hands that moved with the disciplined economy of someone who had been carrying invisible weight for a very long time, had slid her last $5 across a counter to cover a stranger's coffee. Not with charity, not with pity, not with the self-congratulatory warmth of someone performing kindness for an audience. She had done it the way you breathe, because it was what her body did, because not doing it was not an option her nervous system recognized. He sat in the back seat of the SUV, the leather sighing beneath him as he adjusted his position, the rain drumming on the roof in a rhythm that was almost meditative. The vehicle smelled of leather and the faint, clean scent of the ventilation system, a hermetically sealed world of controlled temperature and controlled silence and controlled everything. His chief of security, a man named Sava, whose loyalty had been tested and confirmed over 23 years of service, sat in the passenger seat ahead of him, his eyes on the side mirror, watching the street with the practiced vigilance of someone for whom relaxation was a concept, not a practice. "Who is she?" Dominic said. It was not a question. It was an instruction. Sava did not turn around. He did not need to. He had already noted the diner, the waitress, the brief interaction at the counter, the declined card, and the small, quiet act that followed. He had processed all of this and filed it in the mental architecture that made him invaluable, the ability to observe, categorize, and retrieve information with the speed and precision of a system designed for exactly this purpose. He lifted his phone and typed a message to the team's intelligence officer without speaking. The response would come within the hour. It always did. The machine that operated around Dominic Valenti was efficient the way a Swiss movement is efficient. Every component calibrated, every function essential, no wasted motion, no wasted time. The SUV pulled away from the curb and merged into the rain-slicked traffic, its taillights bleeding red into the wet asphalt. And the diner on the corner of Briarton and 9th returned to what it had been before Dominic entered it. A small box of light in a city full of small boxes of light, each one containing its own small economies of hope and exhaustion and the stubborn, irrational persistence of human beings who keep showing up for shifts they cannot afford to work and jobs that cannot afford to pay them. By the time Elena arrived at Rosie's the following afternoon for her 2 to midnight shift, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained the color of unpolished silver, heavy and low, pressing down on the city like a hand on a chest. The puddles on the sidewalk reflected the buildings above them in warped, trembling versions of themselves, and the air smelled of wet concrete and the exhaust of delivery trucks double-parked along 9th Street. She tied her apron, checked the coffee machines, restocked the sugar caddies, and began the familiar choreography of a shift that would consume the next 10 hours of her life in exchange for $67, before taxes, plus whatever accumulated in the tip jar. Denny was already in the kitchen, his radio tuned to a different station today, classic rock instead of jazz, and the muffled sound of electric guitars filtered through the partition like a distant argument. The afternoon passed in the usual rhythm of customers and orders and small transactions. A group of construction workers in hard hats and fluorescent vests. A woman with 2 children under 5 who ordered grilled cheese sandwiches and spent most of the meal negotiating a ceasefire between her offspring over the ownership of a single crayon. An elderly man who came in every Tuesday and Thursday for the pot roast special and always paid in exact change. The coins lined up on the counter like small soldiers awaiting inspection. Elena moved through it all with the fluid, rehearsed efficiency of someone who had memorized the steps of a dance she performed in her sleep, refilling coffees before they were requested, clearing plates before the absence of food became a vacancy, anticipating needs with a precision that was not warmth but was adjacent to it, close enough that most people could not tell the difference. At 4:17 the door opened and a man walked in, who was not the man from last night, but who carried with him the unmistakable atmosphere of that man's world. He was shorter, broader, built like something designed to absorb impact, with a shaved head and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same material as the curbstones outside. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a dark sweater, and his eyes swept the room with a single, comprehensive glance that catalogued every exit, every person, every potential variable with the speed and detachment of a security camera. He sat at the counter. He ordered coffee. He drank it in silence. He left a $100 bill under the saucer and walked out without waiting for change or acknowledgement. Elena stared at the bill. She picked it up. She held it to the light, because a $100 bill at Rosie's was not a tip. It was an event, and her first instinct was to verify that it was real. It was real. She put it in the tip jar. She said nothing to Denny. She continued her shift. At 6:42, a woman entered, tall, immaculate, dressed in a camel-colored coat that moved with her like a second skin, her hair pulled back in a style so precise it looked engineered. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm, and she sat in the booth nearest the counter and ordered a cup of tea with the specific, unhurried diction of someone who was accustomed to having her preferences remembered. She drank her tea. She opened the portfolio and removed a single sheet of cream-colored paper, which she placed on the table facing the empty seat across from her. Then she looked at Elena. "Elena Maris?" the woman said. Not a question. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a tectonic movement, subtle but deep, the kind of internal rearrangement that happens when the world you thought you understood reveals a door you did not know existed. She set down the coffee pot she had been carrying and approached the booth. "Who are you?" Elena said. The woman did not smile, but something in her expression softened by a fraction of a degree. "My name is Katarina. I work for someone who would like to offer you a position." The paper on the table was a job offer. Elena did not touch it. She stood beside the booth with her hands at her sides and read it from where she stood, her eyes moving across the text with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who had learned that documents were landscapes with hidden terrain, and that the most dangerous features were always in the fine print. The offer was for a position as a private chef and household coordinator at a residential estate. The salary listed was more than Elena made in a year at the diner. The benefits included health insurance, housing, and a car. The employer's name was not on the document. Elena looked at Katarina. She did not ask who the employer was because she already knew, not the name, not the details, but the shape of it, the silhouette. She knew the way an animal knows when the weather is about to change, through instinct honed by survival, rather than information gathered through inquiry. "I am a waitress," Elena said. "Not a chef, not a household coordinator. I pour coffee and I wipe counters and I take orders from people who do not look at me." "Why would your employer want me?" Katarina regarded her with the patient, assessing calm of someone who had delivered many such offers, and who understood that the ones worth making were always the ones that were initially refused. "Because he looked at you," Katerina said, "and he saw someone who does not need to be seen in order to know her own worth." Elena did not respond immediately. She felt the weight of the offer like a physical force, a gravitational pull that was not coercive, but was undeniably present, bending the trajectory of her evening and possibly her life in a direction she had not anticipated when she had tied her apron 2 hours ago. She thought of the $5. She thought of the man's face when the card was declined, the absolute absence of embarrassment, the stillness that was not passivity, but power held in reserve. She thought of her mother's bills. She thought of the mattress on the floor, and the shoes that were wearing through at the soles, and the bus rides that consumed her mornings, like a slow-moving tax on her existence. "I will think about it," Elena said. Katerina nodded. She did not press. She did not pitch. She placed a card on the table beside the offer, a card that was as matte and black and featureless as the one Elena had swiped through the diner's ancient reader the night before, except this one had a phone number embossed on its surface in the same shade of black, readable only when tilted to catch the light. She stood, buttoned her coat, and walked out of the diner without looking back, leaving the tea half-finished and another $100 bill beneath the saucer. Elena picked up both items. She held the card in one hand and the bill in the other, and she stood there in the aisle between the counter and the booths, the fluorescent lights humming above her, Denny's radio playing something with a saxophone, the smell of coffee and grease and lemon cleaner filling her lungs, and she made a decision, not to accept, not to refuse, but to understand. Because Elena Maris had survived the last 3 years of her life by understanding the precise dimensions of every room she entered, the exact weight of every burden she carried, and the real cost of every choice she made, and she was not about to walk through a door she had not measured first. She finished her shift. She served her tables. She split the tips with Denny, keeping the $200 bills separate because they were not tips from regular customers. They were messages written in currency, and she did not yet know the language they were written in. She clocked out at midnight, walked to the bus stop, rode home, and sat on her mattress with the black card in one hand and her phone in the other. She did not call the number. She searched it. No results. She searched the address listed on the job offer. A residential estate in the hills north of the city, property records showing ownership by a holding company, whose name was a string of letters that meant nothing to anyone who did not speak the language of corporate obfuscation. She searched deeper, following the threads of ownership through layers of LLCs and trust structures, the skills she had learned not from any formal training, but from 3 years of fighting insurance companies, and hospital billing departments, and the labyrinthine bureaucracies that stood between her mother's care and the institutions that were supposed to provide it. She was not an investigator, but she was a woman who had been forced to become her own advocate in a system designed to make advocacy impossible, and the skills that effort had forged in her were sharper than she knew. By 2 a.m, she had a name. Valenti. She searched that too, and the results that came back were a landscape she had never imagined standing in, a terrain of power and influence and rumor and fear that stretched across the city and beyond it, a name that appeared in news articles about charitable foundations and real estate developments and, further down, in the murkier waters of investigative journalism and criminal speculation, allegations never proven, connections never confirmed, a shadow that fell across the city's official story, like a second narrative running parallel to the first, darker, deeper, and infinitely more real. She put down her phone. She stared at the ceiling. The rain had started again, lighter now, a whisper against the glass rather than a battering, and the sound of it was almost gentle, almost kind, as if the sky was trying to apologize for something. She closed her eyes. She saw the man's face, the stillness, the eyes that had looked at her not as a waitress, but as something else, something she could not name because no one had looked at her that way since her mother died, as a person, as someone worth seeing. She picked up the phone. She dialed the number. The voice that answered was Katerina's, calm, precise, expectant. "I have conditions," Elena said. Katerina was silent for a moment. Then she said, "He expected you would." The car arrived at 7 the following morning. Not a limousine, not a show of ostentatious wealth, but a black sedan with tinted windows, and a driver who opened the rear door for Elena with the practiced, unhurried courtesy of someone who had been trained not to make the person he was serving feel served. Elena wore the best clothes she owned, which were not good but were clean and pressed and assembled with a care that communicated respect without pretension. Dark slacks, a white blouse, flat shoes that she had wiped down with a damp cloth until they looked almost new. Her hair was down, falling past her shoulders in a dark curtain that she had considered pulling back, but had ultimately left free because pulling it back felt like armor, and she wanted to arrive as herself, unguarded, unshielded, prepared to see and to be seen. The drive took 40 minutes, climbing out of the city's grid of concrete and commerce into the hills where the streets curved, and the houses grew larger, and the trees were old enough to have witnessed the city's entire history from their elevated vantage points. The estate was not visible from the road. A gate, black iron, opened without the driver pressing a button, as if the property itself had recognized the vehicle and granted passage. The driveway wound through a landscape of manicured grounds that were not ostentatious, but were deeply, quietly beautiful. Old oaks and stone pathways, and a silence that was not emptiness, but fullness. The silence of a place where noise was unnecessary, because everything that mattered was communicated through other means. The house was stone and glass, modern in its lines but classical in its proportions, a structure that managed to be both imposing and elegant without succumbing to the vulgarity of excess. Elena counted windows. She noted exits. She observed the security cameras positioned with a subtlety that most visitors would never notice. Small, dark eyes recessed into the architecture, like the compound lenses of an insect, watching from every angle simultaneously. Katerina met her at the front door. Today she wore a dark blue dress and the same precise hairstyle, and she led Elena through an entrance hall that smelled of cedar and something floral that Elena could not identify, past a living room whose furnishings were expensive but not new, chosen for comfort and quality rather than display, through a corridor hung with photographs that Elena did not stop to examine but registered in her peripheral vision. Images of landscapes and people, and a woman who appeared in several of them, dark-haired and beautiful, who Elena would later learn was Dominic's mother, who had died when he was 19, and whose absence had shaped the architecture of his adult life, the way a missing load-bearing wall shapes a building invisibly, structurally, in every room. The kitchen was the heart of the house, and Elena recognized it immediately as a space that had been designed by someone who understood food, not as fuel or as performance, but as craft, as language, as a form of care made tangible. Professional-grade appliances, a central island of butcher block that had been seasoned by years of use, knife racks holding blades that she could see from across the room, were balanced and maintained with an attention that bordered on devotion. A window above the sink looked out over a garden, where herbs grew in ordered rows, and the light that came through it was the clean, gray-gold light of a morning in the hills, softer and more honest than the fluorescent assault of the diner. Dominic Valenti was standing by the window, not sitting, standing with a cup of coffee in his hand, looking out at the garden with the stillness that she now recognized as his fundamental mode of being, not the stillness of inaction, but the stillness of a man who had calculated every variable and was waiting for the world to present the one he had not yet accounted for. He wore dark trousers and a black sweater, no jacket, no suit, and the informality did not diminish him. It revealed him. Without the armor of the suit, he looked less like a monument and more like a man, but a man whose physical presence still dominated the room the way a grand piano dominates a parlor, through sheer density of purpose. He turned. He looked at her. The same gaze, the same unhurried assessment. But something was different today. The diner had been neutral ground, anonymous. A space where identity was suspended in the amber of fluorescent light and the democracy of bad coffee. This was his ground, his kitchen, his air. And the fact that he had chosen to meet her here, in the most domestic and unguarded room of his home, was itself a statement. a communication in the language of space and proximity that said, "I am showing you something real." "You paid for my coffee," he said. The voice was the same. Low, controlled, freighted with the weight of a man whose words were never wasted, because each one cost something he could not replenish. "Your machine was broken," Elena said. "It was $4. "It was not $4, Dominic said. He did not explain what he meant by that. He did not need to. The meaning hung between them like a chord struck on an instrument whose resonance filled the room and continued to vibrate long after the initial impact. He gestured to the kitchen. She understood the gesture. It was not an order. It was an invitation. "Show me." Elena looked at the kitchen. She looked at the tools, the surfaces, the ingredients she could see in the open pantry, the garden through the window where rosemary and thyme and basil grew, in the quiet, disciplined abundance of plants tended by someone who understood that growing things required patience, consistency, and the willingness to work in silence. She looked at all of this, and she felt something she had not felt in 14 months. Possibility. Not the abstract, motivational poster version of the word, but the real, physical, material version. The sensation of standing in a space that had been built for exactly the thing she knew how to do, but had not been allowed to do, since her mother's illness had collapsed her world into the narrow corridor between survival and despair. She washed her hands. She rolled up her sleeves. She opened the pantry. What she cooked was not elaborate. It was not intended to impress. She made a frittata with herbs from the garden. The eggs cracked with a one-handed precision that she did not think about because it was stored in her muscle memory, deposited there by years of cooking beside her mother in a kitchen that was 1/10 the size of this one, but had been filled with the same essential ingredient. The understanding that food prepared with attention and care was a form of love that transcended the economic circumstances in which it was made. She sliced bread, toasted it, arranged it on a plate with a discipline of presentation that was not decorative, but structural, each element placed in relation to the others with the same instinct for balance and proportion that her mother had applied to musical composition. She set the plate in front of Dominic Valenti. He sat at the island. He ate. He ate slowly, with the same deliberate attention he had given to the coffee in the diner, and Elena watched his face for the micro-expressions that would tell her what words would not. A slight movement of the jaw. A pause between bites that lasted a fraction longer than mechanical consumption would require. A look, brief and unguarded, that crossed his features like sunlight crossing a room before a cloud intervenes. He set down his fork. He looked at her. "Who taught you?" he said. "My mother," Elena said. And then, because she was not a woman who hid behind pleasantries or deflection, she added, "She died 14 months ago. Ovarian cancer. The insurance covered some of it. The rest is mine to carry." She said this without self-pity. She said it the way you state a geographical fact, the way you say the river runs east or the mountain is 6,000 feet, with the calm acceptance of someone who has incorporated a difficult truth into the landscape of their life and has continued to navigate by it rather than pretending it does not exist. Dominic studied her. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that silence was not the absence of communication, but its purest form, a space in which truth could exist without the distortion of language. "The salary on the offer," he said. "It is negotiable." "The salary is not why I am here," Elena said. "I know," he said. "That is why it is negotiable." Elena felt the architecture of the moment, the way it was constructed, the way each word and each silence was a structural element in a conversation that was building toward something she could not see but could feel. The way you feel a building rising around you before the roof is in place, the shape of the space emerging from the intention of its design. She understood, standing in this kitchen, that Dominic Valenti was not offering her a job. He was offering her a position in a structure, a role in an organization, a place in a world that operated by rules she did not yet know, but that she could learn. The way she had learned to navigate hospital bureaucracies and insurance denial letters, and the Kafkaesque corridors of a medical system that had tried to crush her and had failed because she was built, like her mother, from materials that did not crush easily. "I have conditions," she said again. He waited. The waiting was itself an answer. It said, "I am listening." It said, "Your conditions matter." It said, "I do not take what is given freely. I earn what is offered on its own terms." "I cook," Elena said. "I manage the kitchen. I do not carry messages. I do not deliver packages. I do not pretend not to see things. And I do not lie about what I have seen. If I work for you, I work honestly. And if honesty becomes a problem, I leave. Those are my conditions." The silence that followed was geological. It lasted long enough for the light in the kitchen to shift, the gray gold softening into something warmer as the clouds outside rearranged themselves around the sun. Dominic looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that she would later understand was the rarest thing he possessed, rarer than his wealth, rarer than his power, rarer than the network of loyalty and fear and obligation that held his empire together like the iron skeleton inside a skyscraper. She saw respect, not the transactional respect of a man assessing an asset. The genuine article, the recognition of a quality he valued above all others, because it was the quality his mother had possessed, and the quality the world had spent his entire adult life trying to beat out of him. Integrity. Unperformable, untradeable, incorruptible integrity. "Katerina," he said without raising his voice, without turning his head. Katerina appeared in the doorway, as if she had been waiting, which she had. "Draw up the contract," Dominic said. "Her conditions. All of them." Elena did not smile. Smiling would have been premature, a concession to relief that she had not yet earned the right to feel. But something in her posture changed, a micro-adjustment in the architecture of her spine, a straightening that was not defiance but alignment, the physical expression of a body that had spent 14 months hunched against the weight of the world, and was now, for the first time, standing in a space that did not require hunching. She began that day. She cooked lunch. She cooked dinner. She organized the pantry with a system that Katerina later described to Dominic as military grade. Every ingredient cataloged, every expiration date noted, every tool cleaned and returned to its designated position, with a precision that suggested not obsessiveness, but respect. The same respect a musician shows an instrument, the understanding that the tools of a craft deserve the same care as the craft itself. She met the staff. A housekeeper named Miriam, who had worked for the Valenti family for 30 years, and whose eyes assessed Elena with the careful neutrality of someone who had seen many people enter this house and had watched most of them leave. A groundskeeper named Old Tom, who communicated primarily through nods and the strategic placement of fresh herbs at the kitchen door. A security detail that was present everywhere and visible nowhere, men and women whose professionalism was measured by their invisibility. She did not see Dominic again that first day. He had left the kitchen after the contract instruction, disappearing into the deeper rooms of the house with the silent, purposeful movement of a man whose days were structured around obligations and calculations that did not include cooking, or conversation, or the ordinary rhythms of domestic life. But his presence was in every room she entered, not physically but architecturally, the way the designer of a building is present in every room even after they have left, through the choices they made, the proportions they established, the light they allowed, and the light they excluded. That night, Elena slept in the guest suite on the second floor, a room with a real bed and clean sheets that smelled of lavender, and a window that looked out over the garden where the herbs grew in their disciplined rows. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence of the hills, which was a different silence than the silence of her apartment. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of containment, a silence that held things rather than emptied them. She thought about her mother. She thought about $5. She thought about the strange, unlikely, almost absurd chain of events that had brought her from a diner counter to a stone house in the hills. And she did not try to make sense of it, because sense was a luxury she would afford later. For now, she slept. The weeks that followed were an education. Elena learned the rhythms of the household, the way a musician learns the rhythms of an orchestra, by listening, by watching, by understanding that every element had its own tempo, and that the art was not in mastering any single element, but in perceiving the relationship between all of them simultaneously. She learned she cooked meals that were precise and seasonal, and informed by the same philosophy her mother had taught her, that food should nourish without overwhelming, comfort without indulging, and that the highest expression of cooking was not complexity, but clarity, each ingredient allowed to be itself rather than buried beneath technique. She noticed that he ate differently when the food was good, not with enthusiasm, which was an emotion she suspected he had surgically removed years ago, but with attention, the same focused, evaluative attention he brought to everything, as if each meal was a problem to be understood, and each flavor was a variable to be weighed. They did not speak often. When they did, it was in the kitchen, and it was brief, and it carried the compressed density of communication between two people who had both learned that words were expensive and should be spent accordingly. He asked about ingredients. She explained her choices. He told her about a dish his mother had made, once, in passing. The only time he mentioned his mother to her in those early weeks, and Elena heard in the way he said it, the slight downward inflection, the pause before the word mother as if he was reaching across a distance to retrieve it, the same geography of grief she knew from her own internal landscape, the same terrain of loss mapped not in words but in the spaces between them. One evening, 3 weeks into her employment, Elena was in the kitchen preparing a reduction when she heard voices from the front hall. Not the usual voices. These were louder, harder-edged, carrying the tonal quality of men who were accustomed to being loud, because loudness was the only form of authority they understood. She heard Sava's voice, low and controlled, and then a voice she did not recognize, a voice that was thick with something that might have been alcohol, or might have been rage, or might have been both. She did not leave the kitchen. She continued her reduction. But she listened, because listening was a skill her survival had sharpened into something approaching a weapon, and what she heard through the walls and corridors of the house was the sound of a negotiation that had become a confrontation. A man named Corsetti, she would later learn, a contractor whose debts to Dominic's organization had accumulated to a point where the numbers had become a form of pressure, and who had arrived uninvited, with 2 men of his own, to renegotiate terms that were not negotiable. The sounds escalated. A chair scraped. Glass broke. Elena heard Sava's voice sharpened to a blade's edge, and then Dominic's voice, cutting through the noise the way a scalpel cuts through tissue, precise, devastating, and final. 1 sentence. She could not hear the words. She did not need to. The quality of the silence that followed told her everything. It was the silence of a room in which power had been exercised so completely that the air itself had submitted. 5 minutes later, the front door opened and closed. An engine started. Gravel crunched under tires. The house reassembled its silence around the departure like water closing over a stone. Elena continued her reduction. She plated the dinner. She set it at Dominic's place at the dining table, a long oak table that could seat 12, but where he always sat alone, at the head, with the garden visible through the windows behind him, and she returned to the kitchen to clean. He came in an hour later. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, and he looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his face that was not control, not assessment, not the calculated stillness of a man managing the impression he made on every room he entered. She saw exhaustion. Real, unmanaged, human exhaustion. The kind that accumulates not from physical labor, but from the constant, unrelenting effort of holding a world together through force of will and the strategic application of a power that exacts a toll on the wielder, as surely as it exacts a toll on those it is wielded against. "The frittata," he said. Elena waited. "Make it again," he said. "The way you made it the first morning." She understood. It was not about the frittata. It was about the first morning, about the kitchen, about the simple, uncomplicated transaction of a meal prepared without agenda, without leverage, without the exhausting calculus of power and obligation that governed every other interaction in his life. He was asking for something simple. He was asking for something real. She made the frittata. She used the herbs from the garden. She cracked the eggs with one hand. She cooked it the way her mother had taught her, with patience and attention, and the understanding that the difference between competence and care is invisible to the eye, but unmistakable to the tongue. She set it in front of him at the island, not the dining table, and she poured him a cup of coffee, black, and she stood on the other side of the island and ate her own plate, because it was late and she was hungry, and because eating together was a form of honesty that neither of them had access to in any other context. They ate in silence. The kitchen was warm. The garden outside the window was dark, the herbs invisible, the sky above the hills scattered with stars that were visible here in a way they never were in the city, where light pollution smeared the heavens into a permanent dusk. The clock on the wall ticked. Somewhere in the house, the security system hummed its quiet electronic vigil. "My mother used to say," Elena said, and then she stopped, because she was not sure she wanted to finish the sentence. Not sure she wanted to open that particular door in the presence of a man whose capacity for response she had not yet calibrated. But he was looking at her, and his eyes were not cold. They were not warm either. They were attentive, present. The eyes of a man who was, for this one moment, not managing or assessing or calculating, but simply listening. "My mother used to say that a meal shared in silence is worth more than a conversation shared over nothing," Elena said. Dominic set down his fork. He looked at his plate. He looked at the garden window, dark and starlit. He looked at her. "Your mother," he said, was correct. And in that moment, in the quiet kitchen of a stone house in the hills, with the sound of the clock and the hum of the security system and the vast, starlit silence of the night pressing against the windows like something alive, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not cinematically, but structurally. The way a foundation settles. The way two parallel lines followed far enough reveal that they were never truly parallel, but were converging all along, slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward a point of intersection that was always inevitable but could never have been predicted. Elena Maris had slid her last $5 across a counter to cover a stranger's coffee. She had done it because her mother had taught her that kindness was not a luxury, but a structure, a load-bearing wall in the architecture of a life, and that removing it to save money was the kind of economy that brings the whole building down. She could not have known that the stranger was a man who had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who calculated the cost of every gesture and who gave nothing without expecting a return. She could not have known that her $5, worthless in the economy of his wealth, was priceless in the economy of his isolation. She could not have known that she had, with that single unremarkable act, answered a question he had stopped asking years ago: whether anyone was still capable of giving something for nothing. 6 months later, Elena stood in the kitchen of the stone house and looked out the window at the garden she now tended herself, the herbs growing in their disciplined rows, the rosemary she had added, the lavender that was her mother's favorite, the basil that grew so aggressively she had to trim it twice a week. The kitchen was hers now in a way that went beyond employment. It was hers the way a studio is a painter's, the way a stage is a performer's, the space where the truest version of herself existed and operated without apology or diminishment. She had paid off her mother's hospital bills. Not through Dominic's generosity, though his salary made it possible, but through her own systematic, disciplined, unrelenting effort. The same effort that had kept her alive through the diner months, redirected now toward elimination rather than survival. The stack of white envelopes on the kitchen table in her old apartment was gone. The apartment itself was gone. She lived in the guest suite that was no longer a guest suite but her room, with her books on the shelves and her mother's photograph on the nightstand, and a closet that contained clothes she had chosen rather than clothes she could afford. Dominic stood in the doorway. He did this sometimes. Stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched her work the way you watch a fire, not to monitor it, but because the movement and warmth of it satisfied something that had been cold for a very long time. He was wearing the black suit today, which meant he was going into the city, which meant the day would be governed by the pressures and negotiations and carefully managed confrontations that constituted his professional life. But he was here, in the doorway, for this one moment, and that moment was his. "Elena," he said. She turned. She was holding a knife, mid-chop. her hands steady, her posture the posture of a woman who had found her ground and intended to keep it. He did not say what he had come to say. Perhaps he had not come to say anything. Perhaps he had come to stand in the doorway and see the kitchen occupied by someone whose presence in his house had changed its atmosphere, the way opening a window changes the air in a room, not by adding something foreign, but by allowing something necessary to circulate that had been trapped. "The coffee this morning," he said. "It was good." "It is always good," Elena said. And there it was, finally, the ghost of something that in another person would have been a smile, a barely perceptible shift in the muscles of his face that acknowledged her response not as insubordination, but as the rarest thing in his world. Honesty, spoken without fear. He turned and walked toward the front door, where Sava waited with the car, and Elena watched him go. And then she returned to her chopping, the knife moving in clean, rhythmic strokes against the butcher block, the sound of it filling the kitchen like a heartbeat, steady and sure and unrelenting. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds above the hills, and the garden lit up in that sudden, startling way that happens when light arrives after a long absence. Every leaf edged in gold, every shadow sharp and defined, the world revealed in its full detail for a moment, before the clouds regrouped and the softer, more complicated light returned. But for that one moment, everything was clear. Some people spend their entire lives building walls so high and thick that nothing can reach them, and they call it strength. And some people spend their last $5 on a stranger's coffee and call it nothing. The walls always fall eventually. The coffee never does.